Welcome to The Debate. Our focus today is on Erikson's masterful framework, the theory of psychosocial development. This model outlines 8 sequential stages of life, each demanding resolution of a specific core crisis, from basic trust versus mistrust in infancy, all the way to ego integrity versus despair and maturity.
And the source material really presents this as a structured, almost prescriptive roadmap for a healthy life. So the central fiction we're facing here is the implied, and maybe intended, rigidity of this sequence. We're asking, does the theory necessitate that an individual who fails to fully resolve foundational crises, particularly those early in life, is strictly determined to experience negative outcomes like stagnation or despair decades later?
Exactly. I'll be arguing that sequential nature is paramount. The successful navigation of each stage is really a prerequisite for psychological strength in the next. You have to complete that initial scaffolding before the structure can safely rise.
And I will be challenging that strict sequential dependency and in the notion of permanent psychological damage. While I acknowledge the utility of the stages in describing common crises, I contend that the model allows for significant opportunity for, let's say, corrective resolution and psychological repair in later life, especially given the radical shifts in social influence Erikson himself describes.
I see why you'd think that, but let me return to the concept of psychological capital, or what Erikson called ego strength. This is not merely an abstract concept. It is the fundamental virtue gained at the successful conclusion of a stage. The entire structure implies a necessary foundational hierarchy where these virtues, well, they accumulate. If we look at stage 1, basic trust versus mistrust, successful resolution results in the virtue of hope. If that infant fails to resolve this crisis and is left with pervasive mistrust, they lack hope, the foundational belief that the world is reliable and safe. This absence of hope, it prevents the confident assertion of will, which is the virtue required for stage 2, autonomy versus shame and doubt. The failure doesn't just create an issue in infancy, it compromises the internal machinery needed for all subsequent development, leading to the pessimism and stagnation the text explicitly mentions in midlife.
That is a compelling argument regarding the accumulation of virtues. I'll give you that. Though I would frame the function of the stages differently. While Erikson maps the ideal accumulation of these strengths, the structure must also account for human adaptability. To insist on a perfect, linear buildup risks ignoring the massive shifts in key social influences that Erikson outlined, which I see as external repair mechanisms. The key influences shift from the immediate singular influence of the mother in stage 1 to peers and role models in adolescence, stage 5, and finally to partners and friends in early adulthood, stage 6. If the social sphere that defines the crisis and offers resolution changes that drastically, moving from intimate dependence to broad autonomous choice, it logically suggests that a successful, profound relationship established in stage 6 might offer enough compensatory security to effectively remediate early mistrust from a stage 1 failure. The individual has a new basis for trust independent of the original parental foundation.
Okay, let's focus on that foundation then, because it dictates the capacity for subsequent relationships. Stage 1 is the primal scaffolding. If the infant does not establish the virtue of hope, if they learn that the world is fundamentally unreliable, how can they approach the question of stage 2, is it okay to be me, or stage 3, is it okay for me to do what I do? These stages of autonomy and initiative, they require a degree of self-confidence and a proactive approach to the world that simply cannot flourish if the core assumption of safety is missing. If you don't possess the internal capacity for self-assertion, if you are crippled by deep shame and doubt from an inability to successfully separate from your parents in stage 2, then entering the expanded social landscape of stage 4, industry, and stage 5, identity, becomes less about seeking mastery and belonging, and more about navigating an environment that you perceive as hostile. The external opportunity for resolution is present, sure, but the internal readiness to utilize it effectively is fundamentally impaired.
I'm sorry, but I just don't accept that developmental failure in an infant or toddler stage permanently closes the door on psychological health, regardless of the ideal virtues. That view, it just ignores the incredible corrective power of later developmental phases, particularly the adolescent period. Consider stage 5, identity versus role confusion. Erikson calls this period a psychological moratorium. It is an opportunity, often a crucial one, for the adolescent to explore and try on new roles, new affiliations, and beliefs separate from the familial dynamic that might have created the early failures. The key influences shift dramatically to peers and role models precisely because this stage is designed to provide an individual with a path to redefine self-worth and trust, even if early parental influence pushed conformity or created deep mistrust. Stage 5 acts as a powerful corrective environment that can override or at least substantially mitigate those primal deficits.
But that corrective environment requires the ego to be resilient enough to explore in the first place. If shame and self-doubt are overwhelming, the individual enters the moratorium not as a free explorer, but as someone desperately seeking external affirmation. Their identity formation will be fragile, based on compliance with a peer group rather than genuine self-discovery. That could lead to what's called a foreclosed identity. The successful resolution of stage 5, resulting in the virtue of fidelity, depends on having enough prior self-belief to commit genuinely to a chosen path. If the lower steps are missing, the person is not exploring, they are hiding.
That is an important distinction. Exploration versus compliance. I agree. However, even if the exploration is initially compliance-driven, the very act of forming a stable, successful intimacy in stage 6, committing to a partner who provides a secure base and authentic affirmation, can retroactively address the self-doubt from stage 2 or the mistrust from stage 1. This new, profound relationship validates the self in a way the original parent-child dynamic failed to do. Development is dynamic, not some kind of permanent ledger tally.
Okay, well, this leads us directly to the more consequential stages, particularly generativity versus stagnation. Your strongest evidence, as noted in the source, is the explicit textual link between not resolving earlier conflicts and becoming pessimistic and experiencing stagnation in adulthood, between 40 and 65. This is not just a correlation. This is Erikson stating a direct causative trajectory flowing from past failures. If a person carries unresolved inferiority from stage 4, from feeling unable to make it in this world, how do they truly engage in generativity, which is the concern for establishing and guiding the next generation?
Exactly. My argument is that the individual who compensates still achieves generativity, but the quality of that resolution is fundamentally compromised. If you enter generativity with unresolved inferiority, your focus shifts. You're less concerned with nurturing others and more concerned with using your role as a mentor or leader to receive external validation, to quiet that persistent internal feeling of being inadequate. You might be productive, yes, but your motivation is narcissistic performance, not genuine care. This is the difference between true generativity and mere activity. Stagnation is the result when that validation eventually fails to materialize.
But doesn't the success of stage 6, where the individual achieves the virtue of love through deep commitment, act as a psychological firewall against the pessimism associated with stage 4, inferiority? If an individual achieves massive success in their career, gains recognition from colleagues who are the key influences in stage 7, and has a strong partnership, are they truly precluded from generativity because of a lingering childhood feeling of inferiority? The sequential requirement seems unnecessarily punitive and fails to recognize how adult identity forged in later successes can logically override old wounds.
I come at it from a slightly different angle, focusing on the mechanics of the shifting social influences themselves. The system isn't closed, it's radically dynamic. If success in stage 4, industry, depends entirely on recognition from teachers and peers outside the family, why should that success be perfectly predicated on the perfect success of stage 3, initiative, which was defined by the entire family unit? Development might be more crisis-specific. If I receive overwhelming validation from my school environment about my competence, that positive feedback, which results in the virtue of competence, well, that should stand on its own, regardless of whether my family suppressed my initiative years earlier.
That's an interesting point about crisis specificity, though I would frame the shift in influence as a necessary consequence of the individual's internal growth. The social landscape expands because the internal capacity to navigate it has been sequentially built. You must first develop the initiative in stage 3 before you can truly benefit from external recognition from teachers in stage 4. The internal structure, the ego strength, is the filter. If that internal structure is weak, the expansion of the social world simply becomes a larger theater for one's anxiety and failure. A child with low initiative might actively avoid the industry demands of school, not because the teachers are unsupportive, but because they lack the purpose to attempt those tasks in the first place. Therefore, the failure flows sequentially forward, limiting the benefit derived from the new social sphere.
This highlights the true tension here. Whether the external context can force internal change, or whether internal capacity dictates external utilization. I maintain that radical external events, like the successful commitment in Stage 6, offer a powerful, even transformative shift. A lifelong partner can help an individual cognitively reframe their past failures, replacing shame and doubt with secure attachment. This is repair, not just compensation, and it fundamentally alters the path toward generativity.
But if repair is possible, what does that mean for the final stage? This brings us to Stage 8, ego integrity versus despair. The theory states that this stage, spanning maturity, requires a final summation, looking back over one's entire life and asking, how have I done? Contentment and integrity only arise if we think we did well. This summation stage implies that the resolutions of the prior 7 stages are being definitively tallied. If there's a significant deficit in that tally, if foundational conflicts were never truly resolved, despair, characterized by bitterness and the fear that time is too short to start over, is the logical, deterministic endpoint.
I'm not convinced that the final stage is merely an accounting exercise. The mechanism of resolution in Stage 8 is achieved by comparing oneself not just to one's own past, but to mankind. This is a massive philosophical context far removed from the maternal relationship of infancy or the schoolyard struggles. If Stage 8 is about this grand comparison, it suggests that the virtue gained, wisdom, allows for transcendence. The mature individual realizes that many of their early failures were due to contextual factors, societal constraints, or the fallibility of their parents. Wisdom allows them to reevaluate and forgive those past unresolved conflicts. Integrity might be achievable not through a perfect sequential scorecard, but through the acceptance and profound synthesis of an imperfect human life within the context of the universal human struggle.
But the language surrounding despair is so potent. Despair is described as feeling time is too short to start over. This points precisely to the sequential nature of development. If you feel compelled to start over, it means the foundation was never sound, and now there is no time left to rebuild it, leading inevitably to bitterness and regret, regardless of philosophical perspective. You cannot philosophize your way out of deep-seated mistrust if that mistrust dictates your fundamental view of the universe.
Yet, a fundamental shift in perspective is a psychological change. Wisdom is not passive acceptance. It is an active reevaluation of history. If the elderly individual can look back and find meaning and coherence despite their setbacks, if they can see their early struggles as preparation for their later wisdom, that constitutes a resolution. The stage is resolved by integration, which is fundamentally an achievement of maturity, not an inevitable tally of childhood success.
The structural strength of Erikson's theory, I believe, lies precisely in its sequential nature, which posits a required developmental hierarchy. The explicit links between an early lack of ego strength and later failure, pessimism, or stagnation strongly argue that the successful resolution of foundational crises is a necessary prerequisite. Without the accumulation of virtues like hope and will, the individual lacks the internal capacity to effectively utilize the external resources and social opportunities that arise in adulthood, making despair a predictable outcome.
While the 8 psychosocial crises are profoundly insightful, insisting on a strict deterministic sequence for resolution risks overlooking the remarkable human capacity for adaptation, repair, and learning within the diverse social context, peers, partners, work, that the theory itself highlights. Development may be more forgiving, allowing later successes, particularly the deep self-definition of identity and the commitment of intimacy, to mitigate or compensate for earlier developmental deficits. leading to integrity through synthesis, rather than merely through a perfect history.
Our discussion demonstrates how deeply Erikson's work, which gave us the language to understand the inner lives of individuals across the lifespan, continues to frame our understanding of a life well lived.
And how experts must constantly explore the degree of flexibility and deterministic weight within that remarkable comprehensive framework.